Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be my September wrap-up. Now for the month of September, I have a total of 8 books to talk about. Some of the books I read for this month were total hits, some were a little disappointing and a bit of a miss, but without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. First book I completed this month is a book I feel like I have not stopped talking about ever since I finished it. It quickly climbed to one of my favorite books I've read so far this year, if not one of my favorite books I've read in the past couple of years. My most anticipated release of the year, that's right folks, I'm talking about Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is R.F. Kuang's newest release. It's a fantasy standalone, and wow, was it a feat from beginning to end. This is a historical, dark academia fantasy novel, and I would also say it kind of leans more heavily on the historical dark academia setting. It definitely does have fantasy components, specifically a magic system, but it's really woven into the intricacies of the historical time and place that R.F. Kuang is sort of unpacking and setting the book in. But if you're not familiar, this story follows our main character Robin, and the story itself opens in 1826. We follow Robin as a young child as he's taken from his homeland of China and brought over to England by a very mysterious professor. Once he arrives in England, he's immediately put to work and training very intensely in Latin and ancient Greece, all in preparation for one day enrolling in a very prestigious translator program at the University of Oxford, otherwise known as Babel. Once Robin grows up, starts attending this university, he has dreams of finally finding a place for himself that he can fit in England, having obviously faced racism and just essentially being othered his entire life. But once he arrives, he realizes that the apparatus of translation is much more than he thought it was, and in fact it's used as a tool by the British Empire itself to maintain its colonial interests, and by helping them in their translation, he is indirectly or very directly hurting places like his homeland. This sort of leads Robin to get involved in rebellion, more specifically student rebellion, and the book sort of takes off from there. This book is incredible. First and foremost, Robin as our main character really rooted us in this story. We're following a huge swath of his life in that we're following him as a young child growing up into a young adult and then kind of finally seizing his own fate and destiny and who he wants to be. This is a takedown of not only dark academia, but is really focused on this particular time period in history. Not only the empire building and the greed of the British Empire during this time, their policies of exploitation of around the world, but also the hypocrisy that existed in the academia space that honestly in a lot of ways persists to this day. This book, you can tell, has so much research in it. Actually, throughout the novel itself, it has footnotes. R.F. Kuang kind of calls to specific references of like academic text or just like specific moments in history to kind of flesh out the reference that is being made in the book. This, I felt like, really added just additional background to this already very rich text. I would say this is technically a fantasy novel, but it's much more a historical novel with fantasy elements. Time and place and the historical references that R.F. Kuang is trying to build and also have commentary on is very much pulled directly from the pages of our own history, and she weaves in a fascinating sort of magic system that works so well with the economic and cultural reality of the time, and it's a really fascinating idea and it worked so well. The story also lives up to its dark academia moniker. It takes place primarily in the University of Oxford, and just the setting, time, and place, and also just like the everyday life of our characters really shines through with this academic vibe. Our main character Robin loves to learn, and the discussion and the learning of languages is really central to this book. Obviously, all of that is kind of put into stark contrast of what this knowledge is used for and also what narratives are pushed to sort of maintain the status quo. It's a really interesting back and forth that R.F. Kuang accomplishes so well. Following our main character throughout the story was just incredible. Robin is a character so easy to root for, and you see him go through so many different internal struggles, from sort of seeking this idea of safety for himself versus trying to push the envelope, support a cause that is much larger than him. The story has so many different central themes, identity to colonialism. I was honestly not able to put this book down once I picked it up. I have an entire reading vlog documenting my experience of this story. It was truly just so good from beginning to end, and I gave it 5 stars. The next book I decided to pick up is The Daughter of Dr Moreau by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is Silvia Moreno Garcia's newest release, and obviously it was immediate buy and read for me just because I love this author's writing and story so much. This is a retelling of The Island of Dr Moreau, which is I think like a gothic sci-fi horror story. But Silvia Moreno Garcia twists sort of this narrative and actually places it in the Yucatan Peninsula in the 19th century. And throughout the story, we actually follow our new main character, which is Dr. Moreau's daughter, Carletta. This is a dual perspective story. We shift between Carletta, one of our main characters, who is young and beautiful and vibrant and full of life, and the other main character we follow is Montgomery, who is Dr. Moreau's sort of assistant in this remote household that they all live in, and he himself has a lot of demons he's running from, and he copes with these demons by drinking a lot of alcohol. And of course, also existing on the island are the hybrids and the experiments from Dr. Moreau's work, which they themselves are actually very central in this story, obviously. Everything sort of is turned upside down though when the son of one of Dr. Moreau's benefactors arrives on the island and actually begins to court Carletta. The story is just first and foremost lush with so much atmosphere. I love Silvia Moreno Garcia's writing so much, and I feel like she's so great at creating like a time and a place that just completely envelops you. What's also interesting is that this is taking inspiration from a gothic story, and I think traditionally, for right or for wrong, when I think like a gothic story, I think a dark, remote, cold, rainy sort of manor, and this is a remote manor within this story, but instead of it being like cold and dreary, it's actually hot and steamy, and we're existing in a jungle, and that sort of transition worked so well. In this book, we're really following Carletta as she's going through an arc of discovery. She, at the beginning of the story, is very naive, and throughout this tale, she kind of has to confront the reality of not only her father, but also the evils of the world itself, and you see her sort of make decisions to try to save herself and her close friends that live on the estate. This story, again, is dual perspective. We're shifting between Carletta and Montgomery, and I found this choice to be a very intriguing one, where Carletta is light and sort of fluttery, and Montgomery is very brooding, and it provides the atmosphere to this sort of gothic horror story, and I felt like it worked oh so well. Silvia Moreno Garcia, for me, writes such dynamic and interesting and often gray morality characters. You're not quite sure what type of relation dynamic to root for, and that is definitely present within this book. I found it to be really engaging. I really loved the setting. I loved that it had sci-fi elements as well, obviously with the inspiration from the original story. I wouldn't say this is my favorite book by this author, as I did find the characters perhaps to not be as fleshed out as I would like, but I found the story itself to be engaging. I wasn't sure where it was going until I finished it. I read it very quickly. So I would give The Daughter of Dr. Moreau a 3.75 4 stars. I was continuing to crave something very atmospheric, so I decided to pick up The Wolf and The Woodsman by Ava Reid. This is said to be for fans of The Bear and the Nightingale and Spinning Silver, so needless to say, I went into this book with very high expectations. This story is inspired by Hungarian history and Jewish folklore. We all know I love any type of mythology, folklore, fantasy retelling, so I was so pumped to pick this book up. In this story, we follow our main character, Veke, and she lives in a village in the middle of a very magical but very dangerous wood. Many generations ago, in her homeland, a outside sort of group of people have taken over and now rule through a very powerful kingdom. They also brought with them a new religion, and Veke and her people are viewed as pagan. She herself is actually born without power, which sort of makes her an outcast within her own town. So when the kingdom sends woodsmen to come collect their yearly sacrifice and tribute to bring back to the king, Veke's town was quick to volunteer her to go as tribute. However, while she's being transported through this very dangerous wood, the monsters come and attack her group of woodsmen who are transporting her, leaving her and one mysterious captain the only survivors. Now they have to rely on themselves to begin to go on a quest, and they also slowly begin to know each other, and so begins the story of The Wolf and the Woodsman. Here's the thing, I would say I'm pretty torn about this book. Elements of it I really loved, and I would also say the first 50% was an absolute knockout for me. I was really drawn in by our two main characters, and I thought all of the concepts that were present within this book were spectacular. That being said, the second half of the book took a bit of a shift. We changed from a quest structure story to more of a traditional political intrigue story, and while the ideas there were fantastic, I found that there just wasn't a enough time to really develop the plot there to feel the full weight of a lot of the storylines the author was trying to include. Like, all of the concepts were fantastic. I just didn't feel like they were paced out properly, if that makes sense. I feel like the true star of this book is definitely Eveke and the woodsman named Gaspar. This is definitely a book that has an enemies to lovers situation, and wow, was it steamy and very, very intense. That aspect of this book made it very hard to put down. The two main characters are honestly very endearing. Gaspar and Eveke were raised amongst people who basically taught them to hate the other group of people. They also have different religions, and specifically Gaspar's religion is full of a lot of like corruption and hypocrisy and is used to really mistreat a lot of the different populations in the area. But Eveke and Gaspar also have something in common in that they were both mistreated rather badly by the people that they were surrounded with. So despite the fact that they're both supposed to hate each other on principle, as they actually get to know each other, they realize they might actually be able to find comfort in one another, which is such an interesting storyline. This book heavily involves conversations around religion and philosophy and the hypocrisy of those in power. It's a really interesting book, and again, all of the concepts there I thought were fantastic. I also really enjoyed the writing style. I truly wish this book was like two books, the first part being its own book, and then the second part kind of given a lot more pages to be fully fleshed out and explained, because I really think this as a duology would have been a knockout. Nevertheless, though, I did like this. Still recommend it, and I would probably give it like a 3.5, 3.25 out of 5 stars. The next book, I won't lie, was a complete disappointment, and that is The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Starling. I had such high hopes for this book because it's a gothic horror story, very Jane Eyre-esque vibes, and that sort of setup is always one of my favorites. This story follows our main character Jane, and she is very practical, she's very smart, she's very no nonsense. She has run the numbers and she's done the calculations, and she's realized that the best way forward for herself is to enter into a marriage of convenience. She's looked at all the eligible bachelors in her area, and she has come to the conclusion that the young doctor Augustine Lawrence would be her best match. He's mysterious and he's very unsure if he actually wants to enter into any type of marriage, but after hearing Jane's idea, he decides to give it a try, though he does have stipulations, and that is Jane is never allowed to visit his crumbling family manor on the outskirts of town, and he really wants to have more of a business arrangement in terms of their marriage. She thinks that's great, that's exactly what she wants, so she agrees. But of course, everything is turned upside down when Jane finds herself kind of stranded in the countryside, and the only home she can turn to is Augustine's family home. There, magic and haunting begin to run wild, and Augustine's past is really called into question. It's mayhem, it's utter chaos, and you think based off of that setup, it sounds oh so interesting, but my difficulty with this book is that I could never buy in on the reasoning of our main character. The entire premise and the entire setup of the story is our main character is practical and very businesslike, and she has no interest in having any type of romantic marriage situation. But the author basically makes our two main characters fall in love like instantly with each other, sort of disregarding any type of promises and obligations they made with one another at the beginning of this book. And Jane seemingly transforms into someone who is like very straightforward to completely irrational overnight. She's jealous about her new husband's past. She's trying to like uncover all of his secrets when this marriage of convenience was literally her idea. It was very hard for me to like really clue into. I did not understand the overnight change in the dynamic of their relationship. It just felt very bizarre to me. On top of that, the book itself is very bizarre. It has gruesome elements, which I did like. It definitely leans into like the gothic horror situation, which I did feel like worked. And there's this sort of haunting occult magic, which is definitely unsettling. But as things really began to accelerate, it just did not really make sense. And I just never really understood Jane's motivation for sticking around and also investigating these very dangerous matters at all. Motivation and the commitment of our main character to put herself in such danger for a man she instantly fell in love with, it never panned out for me. The vibes and the writing I did think were really good. I just didn't really feel like the plot made that much sense. I would check out other books by Caitlin Starling, but unfortunately this book ended up being a big disappointment for me, and I would give it like a 1.5, 2 stars. Luckily though, I immediately redeemed myself and I picked up a first book to a new fantasy series that was impeccable, and I feel like I'm going to be binge reading all of the rest of the books that are out because this was so unique, so political. I am truly obsessed, and that is the Trader Barat by Seth Dickinson. This is like, if you love heavy political fantasy books, like this is the book for you. I'm talking our main character is like a Tyrion Lannister or a Glocta vibe situation. You love people who are maneuvering more with their brains and like backdoor dealing. This is like hand-to-hand combat. This is definitely the book for you, and just the world and the setup of this is just truly genius. But in this story, we follow our main character, Baru Cormorant, and ever since she was a child, she was very, very gifted. And where Baru grew up is a small island nation where she was raised by both her fathers and her mother. In her land, family rearing is a really community oriented and everyone is very close. And they also have their own rights and traditions that have been passed down in her land for generations upon generations. But everything sort of changes when the Empire of Masks arrives on their doorstep. In this world, the Empire of Masks is evil, but it's also incredibly powerful, and they're known for their colonial interests and the slow takeover of every country they sort of run into. How they accomplish this is not through traditional blood and war, but instead through like a slow chokehold, taking over their economy, rewriting culture, forcing education, and basically bulldozing any aspect of this country's identity, forcing people through like economic reliance and promises of technological advancement to sort of go along with it. Baru, as a young child, is quickly singled out as someone who is very talented, so she's put into the Empire of Masks schooling, all in preparation to become a part of their merit-based kind of bureaucratic network. But Baru herself has her own goal, and that is ultimate revenge. She, from a young age, recognizes the evil of this empire, and she also feels like the only way to tear them apart is to do it from the inside. So we follow Baru first as she receives her education and finally her first posting, which is in another colony very far away, who is kind of in constant rebellion. Where she is assigned as the royal accountant. Using the power of the economy, you see how Baru not only entrenches herself in their culture and their society, but also sort of tears it all apart. This book is fascinating. It is cutthroat. It's definitely like for fans of Game of Thrones. It's also described as very Machiavellian. Our main character, Baru Cormorant, is fascinating. She's a genius, and I always feel like she's constantly outsmarting me, and the methods that she uses to sort of accomplish whatever goal she has in mind is so cool to see how it all plays out. This book is very, very dark. The Empire, as I've said, are evil, so are their policies. Seeing all their policies put into place can be incredibly disturbing, but having a main character, Baru Cormorant, who is so determined to get what she wants is also fascinating. This book was full of twists and turns. I could honestly say while reading this book, I never quite knew where it was going, and I wasn't sure what types of decisions Baru Cormorant was going to make, but it was truly a ride from beginning to end, and the ending was absolutely just wow, and I need to know what's going to happen next. Again, if you love very, very political, kind of slower moving fantasy stories, this is a great one to pick up. This definitely does have combat. I don't want to say there's like no war or conflict in this at all, but the people who have the most power in this world are pulling the strings in different ways that don't involve picking up a sword, if you know what I mean. And it's just so good. I loved it. 5 out of 5 stars. After those books, I wanted to pick something up that was a bit of a palate cleanser, something a little fun, a little fluffy. So I decided to read 10,000 Stitches. And this is book 2 to Olivia Attwood's like Fae Regency romance series. And it just was so unbelievably adorable. This is a low spice romance, and we're introduced to our main character, Effie. And Effie is a maid, a very hardworking maid in a very difficult household. And Effie has a problem. She is in love with a gentleman, but maids cannot marry gentlemen, and she's completely resigned that she is just gonna have no luck in this department. Until one day she stumbles into a very peculiar figure known as Lord Blackthorn, or a fairy lord. Lord Blackthorn himself is like trying to become a better person, and he was told to accomplish this, he basically has to help the helpless and hurt the powerful. So he comes across Effie and he's like, I am going to solve all your problems. Let me help you capture the love of your life. Because he's Fae, they sort of have to enter a fairy agreement, and he agrees to help her if she also basically stitches 10,000 stitches into his favorite jacket. Lord Blackthorn, though trying to be helpful, he's also kind of clueless, and he turns into like the most useless fairy godmother you could ever come across. But putting their heads together, they basically make Effie the daughter of a duke. She begins attending balls, trying to win over this very gentleman. I would say it's like fairy Downton Abbey meets Cinderella. Our main character Effie is so pragmatic and smart, and you really see see her throughout this entire story go on a journey of like accepting her own self-worth and also like standing up for herself, accepting her anger, accepting her place in the world. And what I also really enjoy about Olivia Atwater's stories is that the romance is not really so straightforward. Like the tale is not as direct as it appears when reading the synopsis, and I love Lord Blackthorn so much. I think their contrasting characters created so many wonderfully adorable moments, great dialogue. I also love the shift between our world and fairy. It was just so cute, so funny, a super quick read. The book is about 250 pages. It was endearing. I love this series so much. I think they're all adorable, and I can't wait to pick up the next book. Oh, and I would give this book like a 3.75, 4 stars, a super solid romance tale. And then the last two books I'm just going to quickly talk about because I've technically not finished them. I know, I feel like I slacked a bit this month. The first is The Masks of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. I am so close to finishing this book. I have about 100 pages left in this 600-page novel. And this has taken me a while, but I will say I'm enjoying it. And in the story, we follow one of our main characters, Wren, and she is a con artist. And at the beginning of the story, she has arrived back in Nazareth with one goal, and that is to basically steal as much money as possible from the rich families of the city and flee and make a new life for herself with her best friend, Tess. She has this whole scheme. She's basically going to get involved with the lower aristocratic families by pretending to be someone else, and she's going to get close to them, steal their money. It's all going to go according to plan until it isn't. When one sort of dark magical force begins threatening the town, things get much more complicated, as well as Wren's connections to this family kind of get her more entrenched in their life, and conning them becomes much more difficult. So here's the thing. On the surface, that is what this book is about, and that is definitely true, but this is a multi-POV story. We're also following her close friend and like partner Tess's point of view. We also have chapters from like a crime lord that exists in the town that Wren is working with, a detective, any aristocratic individuals. You get the point. This book has a huge cast of characters, and in some aspects, it's definitely its strength. The authors are spending a lot of time kind of fleshing out this world and this city by giving us purview into so many different characters' point of view. But on the flip side of that, I find that this book at times is very hard to follow. There are so many names and political alliances, and just trying to keep track of everything I felt like could be very difficult, and it wasn't necessarily described in the clearest of ways, if that makes sense. The other aspect of this book is that there is a magic system or a magical element, and this is another part of this book I just don't know how clear it's been described to us how it works. It has to do with dreams. It has to do with like fortunes and fate and the interconnectedness of all the people that live here, that sort of thing. But again, in my mind at least, it's a little bit murky. All that to say though, this book does read pretty quick. I do think it is too long at 600 pages, but I am pretty fascinated not only by the world, our main character, but the ever-shifting political alliances. I do think it makes for a very interesting tale. I also appreciate that the authors really went for it in the scale of this novel and didn't cut too much out of it to make it a more simple, streamlined story. I appreciate that this is trying to be a very political and shifty story. Where I'm at with 100 pages left, I am liking this book. I do feel like the second half was stronger than the first half. I think if you can get past sort of the confusing and clunky world building, it is definitely worth reading. I love the vibe of this world too. I'd say it's kind of like a grimy Venice with these different merchant houses vying for power. I think that's a cool setup. I wouldn't say this book is perfect, but I am liking it. There is a lot of mystery that has compelled me to continue to read it. Obviously have 100 pages left, so I'll give a star reading next month once I actually complete it, but I love the sort of lying, backstabbing sort of setting of this. I think it works, and I think book 2 has a chance to be even better than book 1, so it's solid. It's not my favorite, but it's definitely solid. And then the second book I was not able to complete this month is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. I am about 2/3 of the way through this book, and I can say with confidence I am loving this story. It is so intense. It is so gripping. It's honestly, I feel like this could be one of my favorite books of the year. I'm just sort of reading it slowly because I'm really enjoying it, and I didn't want to rush through it as I kind of came to the end of this month. But if you're not familiar, this is a literary fiction tale kind of paralleling two lives of two women. The first is Marion, and we follow her at the turn of the century. We follow her through her childhood, and as she begins pursuing her great passion, which is to become a pilot. Marion becomes an incredibly famous pilot, and she has lots of like nonfiction work written about her, and her death itself also ended up being rather mysterious. Fast forward to present day, we follow our other main character, Hadley, who is an actor sort of embroiled in scandal, and she sort of offered a second chance at a career in Hollywood by playing Marion in a movie. And we see as Hadley begins to do research on Marion's character, and her sort of immersion into Marion's story kind of happens alongside us reading Marion's tale. Structurally, how this book is written is truly fascinating. The chapters themselves are really short. They kind of read almost in a staccato-like nature. You're just moving from scene to scene. It's very, very punchy. This book is full of so many different trigger warnings. I wouldn't say this book is flowery at all. It's actually very intense, and this writing style is very fitting to the characters that are present in this, particularly Marion. Marion is fascinating. She is a force of nature. Her determination to pursue something that she loves so much, which is not only like a very clear career, but also as a woman in this time period. What's fascinating too, and what begins to happen between our characters as we shift between present and past, we begin to see sort of parallels in female identity and what has changed and what has not changed at all in relation to society. A fascinating book to say the least. It just feels charged. This is a book holding back no punches at all. I wasn't really sure what to expect when I picked this up from a literary point of view, but I'm really enjoying like structurally how this book is put together, and it's honestly just so bold, which just makes so much sense because Marion as a person, as an individual, is just simply one of the most vibrant characters I've come across in a long time. And yeah, I'm really liking this book. I'm curious to see how it's all going to wrap up. This will be another book I finish in early October as well. Alrighty guys, those are all of the books I was able to complete for the month of September. Let me know down below some books you read recently, as I would love to know, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye!